The burial chamber sits at the end of a long descending corridor cut into limestone, below the level of the desert, below the level of everything above it. The room is not rectangular. It is elliptical, longer than it is wide, its curved walls enclosing a space that feels, even now, like the interior of something rather than merely a room. The floor is uneven in places where the ancient workers left it so, and the ceiling is low enough that the proportions of the space press inward, intimate, and deliberate. This is KV-34, the tomb of the pharaoh Thutmose III, cut into the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings at Thebes, sealed for most of 3,000 years before modern hands first opened it in the 19th century. It is the earliest place on Earth where the complete 12-hour account of Ra's night passage through the underworld can be found, painted in full from the first hour to the last, on walls that have not moved since the plaster dried. The walls are cream-colored, not white, a softer tone than that, the color of old bone or of paper left in indirect light for a very long time. Against that ground, the figures are painted in black outline, and what strikes anyone entering the chamber for the first time is not the grandeur of the imagery, but its smallness, its precision, its quality of controlled and patient inscription. The figures are rendered in a style unlike the monumental relief carvings of the great temples, not heroic in scale, not gestural, not designed to awe. They are spare, linear. Their outlines are fine and unhurried, as though the painter moved the brush with the same deliberate attention a scribe brings to a text, because that is, in a meaningful sense, exactly what was happening. These are not paintings in the decorative sense. They are a book written on stone, its chapters arranged in horizontal registers that run the full length of each wall, from floor to ceiling. The figures stacked in bands of careful ink stand at the center of that elliptical room and turn slowly, and the effect becomes unmistakable. The walls wrap around the space continuously, one register following another, the figures proceeding from scene to scene without pause or interruption, and the room itself begins to feel less like a room and more like the interior surface of a scroll, a text unrolled and laid around the walls, its beginning at one point and its end at another, the reader positioned inside it rather than holding it in their hands. This quality was not accidental. The Egyptians who designed this tomb understood exactly what they were doing. The walls of the burial chamber were treated as a writing surface first, and a decorative space second, if they were considered a decorative space at all. The book was meant to be inside the tomb, with the dead king surrounding him on all sides, its content present in the room with him for the entirety of whatever came next. The text painted on those walls has an ancient Egyptian name, Duat. It translates with the directness that Egyptian titles often carry as something in the range of that which is in the afterworld. In some of its more formal versions, the title extends further, the Book of the Hidden Chamber, naming not only the content, but the geography it describes, the hidden place through which Red travels in the hours between sunset and sunrise. The title is not a modern scholarly designation. It is not a name given by excavators or translators working in later centuries. It is the name the Egyptians wrote at the head of the text itself, in the same careful black ink as the figures, at the beginning of the first hour's register, where any reader approaching the text from the start would encounter it first. This specificity, a title, a date, a physical location, walls that still exist and can still be entered, is worth dwelling on before anything else. The Amduat is not a reconstruction. It is not a composite assembled from fragments or inferred from allusions in other texts. The earliest complete version of it is physically present in a room in Egypt, painted on plaster over 3,000 years old, and the room can be visited. The text has not changed since the craftsmen who made it, whose names, in most cases, we do not know, set down their brushes and left the chamber for the last time. Whatever was believed about the night passage of the sun through the underworld, the Egyptians believed it with enough conviction to inscribe it on the walls of a king's eternal resting place, in careful, precise, unhurried lines, from the first hour to the 12th, leaving nothing out. The period in which Thutmose III's tomb was prepared, and in which the Duat was painted onto those limestone walls for the first time in its complete surviving form, falls within what Egyptologists designate the New Kingdom, a period running from approximately 1550 to 1070 BCE, a span of nearly 500 years, during which Egypt's imperial reach was at its greatest, and its funerary literature at its most elaborate and most carefully controlled. The Amduat during this period was not a widely distributed text. It did not circulate among the general population. It was not available to any Egyptian who wished to possess it, no matter their wealth or social standing, no matter their devotion, no matter how many other funerary texts they had commissioned for their own tombs. The Amduat was royal property, in the most literal and legal sense of that phrase. It was inscribed on the walls of royal tombs, the burial places of pharaohs, the gods' bodies on earth, the intermediaries between the human world and the divine one, and very occasionally in the burial installations of the most senior priests, those whose ritual proximity to the pharaoh was close enough, and whose function in the maintenance of divine order was specific enough that they might be permitted a portion of its content. This exclusivity was not merely a matter of prestige or privilege in the ordinary social sense, though it was certainly those things as well. It reflected a theological understanding of what the Amduat was and what possessing it meant. The text was not simply a description of the underworld. It was, in the understanding of those who produced and maintained it, effective. The knowledge it contained was useful in a direct and practical sense, and access to that knowledge conferred something. To know the names of the gatekeepers was to be able to speak correctly at the gates. To know the geography of each hour's region was to be able to navigate it. To possess the complete 12-hour account inscribed on the walls of the eternal chamber in which the dead body lay was to ensure that whoever lay in that chamber would travel through the Duat, not in ignorance, but with the full architecture of the underworld already known to them, already mapped, already named. The tomb walls were not decoration around a dead king. They were a guide prepared for his use, and the Amduat was its text. The senior priest in the New Kingdom, who earned the right to incorporate portions of the Amduat into his own burial, would have understood this. Standing in his tomb, surrounded by the registers of the night journey, painted on the walls, in the same black outline and cream ground as the royal examples, he would have been one of a very small number of non-royal Egyptians in the entire country for whom this particular text was accessible. The content around him on those walls was, by the standards of his world, almost exclusively the pharaohs. It had been the pharaohs alone for generations before his time, and would remain so for generations after. His inclusion within that small circle of access was not a casual thing. It would have carried weight, theological weight, the specific gravity of proximity to the divine structure that kept the world in order, night after night, as Ra completed his passage and returned at dawn to animate the living world once more. The 12 sections of the Amduat correspond to 12 hours. This correspondence is precise and structural, not approximate or ornamental. Each section of the text governs 1 hour of the Egyptian night, not metaphorically, not symbolically, in a loose sense, but literally and specifically as a timetable governs a transit. The 12 hours of Rawas night passage are also 12 distinct geographical regions of the Duat, each with its own name, its own population of beings, its own particular character and terrain, and set of requirements. The transition from one hour to the next is a transition from one named place to another, and each place is presented in the text as a self-contained unit, complete in itself, bounded by its own gatekeepers, inhabited by its own specific creatures, governed by its own logic. The 12 hours do not blur into one another. They are discrete, sequential, and separately mapped. The Duat is, among other things, a map, drawn in the form of a text, inscribed on the walls of a room cut into the earth. The precision of this structure is part of what makes the Duat unusual, even within Egypt's extraordinarily rich funerary tradition. The Book of the Dead, the most widely distributed funerary text of ancient Egypt, available in enormous numbers of papyrus copies across many centuries, is a collection of spells, each usable individually, each providing protection or guidance for a specific situation the dead person might encounter. It is a toolkit. The Duat is something different, a complete sequential narrative of a single night's passage, told from beginning to end, with every hour accounted for and every region named. Its architecture is more like a map of a fixed route than a collection of provisions for uncertain terrain. The route is known, the hours are counted. The journey proceeds from the first gate to the last in order, and the text proceeds with it. To move through the registers of KV34 is to move through that sequence. The first hour is here, in this band of figures, on this section of wall. The second hour follows. The third. The progression wraps around the elliptical chamber, hour following hour, until the 12th completes itself at the eastern end of the text, and the cycle closes. The room was built to hold this sequence, its shape fitting the content it contains, the ellipse making room for all 12 hours to exist together in the same space, surrounding the king on all sides simultaneously, so that the complete night passage was always present with him, every hour at once, the entire Duat mapped and inhabited on every wall of the room in which his body lay. The craftsmen who painted these walls were working within a tradition that was already ancient by their own time. The Duat, or texts very like it, had existed in some form before the New Kingdom versions that survive in complete form. The labor of inscribing the complete text across the walls of a burial chamber, the careful preparation of the plaster, the laying out of the registers, the drawing of each figure in its precise black outline, the addition of the hieroglyphic captions that identify each being and describe each event, was a substantial undertaking, and the people who carried it out did so with evident care. The figures in KV34 are not hurried. The outlines are clean, the registers are evenly spaced. Whatever the practical conditions under which this chamber was prepared, and however pressed the craftsmen may have been by the timelines of royal construction, the quality of the work speaks to an understanding that the text was important, its execution worth time, the result worth getting right. There is a quality of deliberateness in those painted lines that is worth sitting with for a moment. The figures in the Duat registers are not attempting beauty in any grand decorative sense. They are not the monumental columns of hieroglyphs in the great hypostyle halls, not the heroic painted ceilings of later royal tombs, not the vivid naturalistic scenes of hunting and feasting found in the tombs of nobles. They are spare and diagrammatic, precise and clear. Every element is present because it needs to be present. Every figure is included because the text requires it. The style is, in a word, functional, but a function so carefully carried out over such a large surface with such consistent attention to detail that the functional becomes its own kind of beautiful. A room covered in patient black outlined figures is a room covered in evidence of concentrated human attention, and that attention is palpable even now, standing on the other side of 3 millennia, looking at the same lines the painter made in the light of an oil lamp beneath the limestone cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, in an Egypt that no longer exists, as a political reality, but whose theological imagination is still entirely legible on these walls. The Valley of the Kings sits on the west bank of the Nile at ancient Thebes, the city the Egyptians called Waset, and which the Greeks later named Thebes after their own famous city, a name that stuck in the scholarly record, though the original has mostly been lost from common use. The West Bank was the site of death in the Egyptian understanding of things, because the sun set in the west and entered its underground passage from that direction. The living city was on the east bank. The tombs of the kings were on the west, cut into the limestone cliffs and dry wadis of the desert margin, a landscape so arid that it preserved the things buried in it for an extraordinary length of time. The descent to KV-34 follows a corridor that drops steadily below the level of the surrounding terrain, the visitor, modern or ancient, moving progressively further underground, the outside world receding behind them and above them, the temperature and the light changing as they go, until they emerge into the elliptical chamber at the end, with the painted walls waiting around them in the dark. That descent, the long descending corridor, the steady drop below the desert surface, the arrival in the painted room, mirrors in its small way the journey the text describes. The Duat was understood to be below the earth, or at least accessible through it, and the tombs that contained the Amduat were themselves a kind of threshold between the upper world and the world the text mapped. The king descended into his tomb as Ra descended into the Duat at the western horizon, entering the underground, the darkness, the hidden territory beneath the visible world, with the expectation of passage through it and emergence at the other end. The architecture of the tomb participated in the theology of the text. The room and the writing on its walls were together a single object. It was during the Third Intermediate Period, beginning around 1070 BCE, when the New Kingdom ended and the tight royal monopoly on the most sacred funerary literature began to loosen, that the Amduat began to make its way out of the royal tombs and into something more portable. The period had its own character, a fragmentation of centralized power, a shifting of authority between competing dynasties, a broader diffusion of religious practice and funerary provision across a wider range of the population. The Book of the Dead had already been moving through this process for generations, its spells appearing in copies prepared for wealthy merchants, skilled craftsmen, priests, and officials who would have had no such access in earlier centuries. The Amduat followed, slowly, in abbreviated form. The abbreviated versions of the Amduat that appear on papyri from this period are not complete texts in the way that the walls of KV-34 are complete. They are condensed, the 12 hours compressed into registers of smaller scope, the figures reduced, the captions shortened, the landscape of each hour present in outline rather than in full detail. What they preserve is the structure, the sequence, the essential architecture of the passage, the 12 hours in their order from first to last. What they sacrifice is the expansive visual experience of walking through a room-sized version of the text, surrounded by all 12 hours simultaneously. The papyrus copy is the journey reduced to something portable, to something that could be rolled and placed alongside its owner in a coffin, carried into the dark in a human hand, rather than inscribed on the walls of a human-shaped space. These papyrus copies could be small. Not all of them. Some funerary papyri from Egypt's later periods are long and elaborately produced objects, multiple meters in length when unrolled, prepared at great expense for wealthy patrons. But the abbreviated Duat papyri could be made compact enough to hold in two cupped hands, their 12 hours inscribed in thumbnail-sized figures on a surface not much larger than a modern book. The reduction in scale does not diminish the content. The 12 hours are still there, the sequence still intact, the essential architecture of the passage still present. It simply changes the object's relationship to its owner. The wall-sized version surrounds the dead king on all sides, enveloping him in the complete map of the Duat, making the journey an environment. The hand-sized version is carried by its owner into that same journey, tucked against the body, or placed nearby in the coffin, accompanying them the way a guide accompanies a traveler, something to consult, something to hold, something whose presence is itself a form of preparation. The cities in which these papyri were produced and used are in many cases still known by their ancient names, or by the names the Greeks gave them, or by the modern names that have settled over the ancient sites like sediment. Thebes remained the great center of Egyptian religious life for much of the period in question. Memphis in the north was another. Saqqara, the vast necropolis near Memphis, holds the remains of funerary installations from nearly every period of Egyptian history. Its desert surface, covering thousands of years of burial practice, including many of the period when the abbreviated Duat papyri were being produced for non-royal individuals. In some of these burials, the papyri no longer survive. The conditions that preserved them in some locations were not present in others, and the objects have perished. In others, the rolls have come down to us, brown and fragile, their figures still legible under magnification, their 12 hours still in order, the sequence of the night passage still intact after 2,500 years or more. What a careful reader of the style of those later papyri notices, and what the walls of KV34 make vivid, in a way that nothing else quite replicates, is the quality of sustained attention that the Duat required of everyone who prepared it. Whether on wall plaster covering hundreds of square meters, or on a small roll of papyrus no larger than a man's hand, the text demanded the same basic thing, that someone sit with it, figure by figure, hour by hour from the first to the 12th, and render it with care. The painter in the royal tomb worked by lamplight over months or years to complete a chamber-sized version. The scribe producing an abbreviated papyrus copy worked in their workshop over days or weeks to compress the same sequence into a format small enough to travel with its owner. In both cases, someone was paying attention to the text, following its sequence, reproducing its figures, preserving its 12-fold structure, and that attention, repeated across centuries in royal tomb and private papyrus alike, is part of what carried the Duat from the New Kingdom to the present, from the walls of Thutmose III's burial chamber to the pages of scholarly publications in languages the ancient Egyptians could not have imagined. The Duat survived because it was made by hands that understood its importance and took the trouble to make it correctly. That is, in the end, a simple fact. But simple facts, when they are this old and this specific, accumulate a particular quality, the weight of all the time that has passed since the making, and all the things that did not survive it, and the somewhat improbable circumstance of a painted room at the end of a descending corridor in the limestone cliffs above the Nile, still containing, on its cream-colored walls, the complete 12-hour account of a journey that was already ancient when the painters made it. The text painted in that room had a title, written in the same black ink as the figures, at the beginning of the first hour's register. It named what it was, where it was set, and what it described, that which is in the afterworld, or, in the longer form, the Book of the Hidden Chamber, a text with a name and a genre, and a physical location, prepared for a specific purpose by specific people, and still there, still on those walls, still legible, still complete, from the first hour to the last. The figures in the registers are very small relative to the walls that hold them. A person standing in the chamber at KV-34 is larger than most of the painted beings in the underworld around them. The gods and blessed dead and gatekeepers of the Duat's 12 hours are rendered in the registers at a scale that fits the human viewing experience comfortably, close enough to read, small enough to take in several at once, precise enough in their outlines that the individual identity of each figure remains clear. This scale is part of the Duat's particular character. The underworld it describes is vast, 12 named regions, 12 successive hours, a geography that encompasses the entire span of a night. But the text that maps it is handled with a small, patient, careful attention, figures no larger than a hand's length, arranged in bands across pale walls in a room below the desert. This same quality of smallness and care travels with the text into its later, more portable forms. By the time the abbreviated Duat appears on papyri prepared for wealthy individuals in the Third Intermediate Period, the 12 hours have been compressed further still, their figures reduced to thumbnail scale, the registers narrowed, the whole night passage fitting on a roll small enough to carry. That roll, prepared with the same attention to sequence and completeness that governed the royal wall versions, placed in a coffin in a city whose ancient name has been overlaid by centuries of subsequent naming, would have been the most portable form of a very old and very carefully preserved account of what happened to the sun between dusk and dawn. Imagine it there, rolled tight, the papyrus brown with age, even at the time of its entombment, the thumbnail-sized figures of the Duat's 12 hours arranged within it, in their proper order from the first to the 12th, the text's title written at its beginning, its final hour completed at its end, resting against the body of its owner in the dark of a coffin, in the dark of a tomb, somewhere in the long arc of Egyptian history, when the night passage of Ra was already a very old story, and had already been written on walls, and rolled on papyrus, and memorized, and rehearsed, and carried through centuries of careful transmission by hands that understood what they were maintaining. Small enough to hold in two cupped hands, old enough that the tradition it preserves stretches back through more kings and more painted walls and more hours of lamplit inscription than any single mind can comfortably hold, and traveling in the dark of its coffin through the very night its 12 hours described. At the western edge of the world, where the desert meets the sky, in a line so flat and so final it seems less like a horizon than a decision, the sun goes down, not gradually, in the way of some climates, the light diffusing and spreading across a wide dusk. In the desert, the transition is clean. The disk touches the edge, it descends, it is gone, and in the moment of its disappearance, according to Egyptian solar theology, something specific happens, something that has nothing to do with the visible sky and everything to do with what lies beneath it. At the exact point where the light ends, a vessel is waiting. The Egyptians held that Ra, the solar principle, the animating force of light and order and the turning of the days, did not simply cease at sundown and resume at dawn. He traveled. The interval between sunset and sunrise was not empty. It was occupied, fully and specifically, by a passage through the underworld, through the place the Egyptians called the Duat, a territory as geographically particular and as carefully mapped as any region of the living world. And this passage required a vessel, it required a crew, it required the right figures in the right positions, prepared in advance for a journey that would take 12 hours, pass through 12 distinct named regions, and bring the sun out the other side, transformed. The vessel prepared for this night passage was called the Mesectet. During the daylight hours, Ra had traveled the sky in a different bark, the Manjet, crossing the 12 hours of day from the eastern horizon to the western one. The distinction between the two vessels was not incidental. The Egyptians were precise about this. Two barks, two journeys, two distinct modes of solar existence, each requiring its own ship, its own crew configuration, its own specific preparation for the kind of passage it was about to make. The Manjet carried the sun across the visible world, illuminated and luminous. The Mesectet received it at the moment of its diminishment and carried it into the dark. At the western horizon, in the last light of the day, the transfer between the two barks occurs. This is not a scene of ceremony or celebration. In the Amduat's registers, painted with the spare diagrammatic clarity of a text that intends to be read rather than admired, the transition is simply depicted as fact. The sun moving from one vessel to the other at the boundary between the living world and the one beneath it. The Mesectet waits. The crew is already in position. The western gateway opens, and the night journey begins. Standing at the prow of the Mesectet, in every depiction the Amduat provides, is a figure with a papyrus scroll. His name is Sia. In Egyptian theology, Sia is the deification of divine perception, of the faculty of sacred understanding, the capacity to apprehend what is real and true about the nature of things. The Egyptians gave abstract capacities form, and Sia's form was that of a human-headed figure at the front of the bark, the scroll in his hands containing the knowledge necessary to recognize what the night would present. He faces forward. He faces the darkness ahead, which is to say he faces the 12 hours of the Duat before any of them have been entered, and his eyes are open. There is something worth dwelling on in the specific position Sua holds on the bark. The prow of any vessel is the part that enters the unknown first, the point of the ship that breaks the water ahead of everything else, that arrives at whatever is coming before the rest of the vessel can. Placing the figure of divine perception at that point is not an accident of arrangement. Sia is there because what the night journey requires before anything else, before physical force, before magical power, before the specific knowledge of names and gatekeepers, is the capacity to see, to perceive correctly, to know what is actually there in the dark ahead, undistorted by hope or by fear, apprehended with the clarity that makes right action possible. The scroll he holds contains the knowledge of the Duat's regions. Some scholars have understood it as a reference to the Amduat itself. The Book of the Night Journey, in the hands of the figure whose function is perception, the map of the underworld, carried by the figure whose purpose is to read what lies ahead. Whether this correspondence was intended or simply inheres in the logic of the image, it gives Sia's position on the prow a kind of layered meaning. The figure of perception holding the text that describes the very journey he is about to help navigate. Both the one who sees and the one who carries the record of what there is to see. Heka occupied a position among the bark's crew as well. Heka, the personification of magical power, the animating force that made ritual action effective, was understood in Egyptian theology not as a god among gods in the ordinary sense, but as something more fundamental than that. Heka was the power that made all divine speech operative. When a priest spoke a spell, when a text written on a tomb wall performed its protective function, when the words inscribed on an amulet acted in the world, all of that efficacy in the Egyptian understanding derived from Heka. He was the medium through which spoken or written words became real actions. And on the bark, moving through the 12 hours of the underworld, Heka's presence was not ceremonial. It was functional. The Duat was full of gates that required the correct words spoken in the correct order. It was full of doorkeepers whose names had to be known and spoken before passage could be granted. It was full of beings who responded not to force or appeal, but to the precise and properly empowered utterance of the right ritual language. Without Heka aboard the bark, the words spoken would be words only, sounds made in the dark with no power behind them. With Heka among the crew, the words became operational, became the things they named, became the force they claimed to be. The bark carried its own capacity for effective speech, its own source of the power that made language real, and it is worth considering what this means for the journey as a whole. The night passage through the Duat is not simply a transit, a matter of moving from one point to another across a fixed terrain. It is an ongoing series of ritual acts, of correctly performed encounters with named figures at named locations, of words spoken that must be exactly right and exactly empowered for the passage to proceed. The presence of Sia and Heka on the bark, perception and magical power, means the vessel is not merely a ship, but a moving ritual complex, complete in itself, carrying everything necessary for the kind of journey the night requires. The bark moved through the first hours of the Duat across navigable water. The painted registers of the Amduat show the waterway clearly, the vessel traveling as a vessel does, borne on the current of the underworld river, the tow rope slack and unneeded in the hours when the water held. In these hours, the crew's positions maintained their configuration. Saya at the prow, Heka among the crew, the other beings who accompanied the bark arranged around the central form of Ra, each in a specific relationship to the others, the whole arrangement purposeful and stable. But the Duat is not a uniform geography. This is one of the things the Amduat establishes with particular care, that the underworld is not a single undifferentiated space of darkness, not a featureless region of shadow through which the sun merely passes. It is a country with distinct territories, and those territories have distinct physical characters. Some have water, some do not. Some have pathways wide enough for the bark to move without assistance. Others do not. And when the waterway ends, when the navigable river of the underworld gives way to sand, to dry terrain across which no vessel can sail, the bark does not stop. It continues, and its means of continuation changes. The tow rope is one of the most persistently depicted elements of the Amduat's registers. It appears an hour after hour, sometimes in use and sometimes not, always present as a visible feature of the bark's construction, a rope attached to the front of the vessel, extending forward through the dark toward whichever crew on the Duat's shore has the responsibility for this particular hour's passage. When the water holds, the rope hangs slack. When the water ends, and the terrain becomes sand or stone or something harder and less yielding than a river, the crew at the other end of the rope leans forward, and the rope goes taut. The beings who served as tow rope crews in the various hours of the Duat were not a single consistent group. The Amduat identifies different beings for different hours, serpent gods, blessed dead, specialized underworld deities, figures whose existence and function was tied to their particular region of the Duat and to no other. A crew that pulled the bark through the terrain of 1 hour had no authority or relevance in the next. Their work was precisely bounded, They received the vessel at the entrance to their region, pulled it across the distance they were responsible for, and released it at the boundary of the next hour's domain, where a different crew was waiting. This arrangement, the sequential handoff of the solar bark from one pulling crew to the next, gives the night journey a particular quality that the Duat's images communicate with great consistency. The bark is never alone. It is never unassisted, never stranded without the beings necessary to move it forward. Each hour has its own guardians, its own crews, its own inhabitants, whose entire existence is oriented toward the passage of the solar vessel through their particular territory. The Duat, for all its strangeness and its darkness, and its departure from the logic of the living world, is thoroughly attended to. Every region is maintained. Every crossing has its designated helpers. This is part of what the Duat preserves, that a simple description of Ra's night journey might not convey. The Duat is not a hostile wilderness. The sun must cross in spite of opposition. It is a cosmos in its own right, ordered and administered, and populated with beings who perform specific functions with the same regularity and purpose as the priests performing their own functions in the temples above. The tow rope crews are, in their way, civil servants of the cosmic order. Their work is particular, bounded, and essential. The bark could not cross the dry terrain without them, and they do not fail. What travels at the center of the bark, what all of this preparation and assistance and attending crew exists to carry through the night, is not Ra in the form he holds during the daylight hours. This distinction is important in the Egyptian understanding of the solar cycle, and the Duat makes it visible in the way it depicts the central figure of the bark. During the day, Ra is luminous, radiant, the full solar disk, the animating warmth and light of the visible world. At sunset, at the moment he descends into the Duat, that form gives way to another. The night-traveling form of Ra is called Ra. The name means approximately Ra as flesh, Ra in the bodily, mortal adjacent condition of a being who is not currently shining, who exists without luminosity, who is present in the world but not yet expressing the full solar force that defines him. The Duat depicts Ra in this diminished form, and the Egyptian understanding of what this means is careful and considered. This is not Ra weakened or damaged. It is Ra in the specific condition that the night requires, a condition analogous, in Egyptian theological terms, to death, to the state of potential, rather than expressed being, to the interval between one cycle of existence and the next. The Egyptians understood the sun's nightly disappearance as a kind of temporary death, and Ra's transit through the Duat as a process of regeneration, not simply a journey from one point to another, but a transformation, a renewal, a return to the source of vitality that made the dawn possible. Ra traveling through the underworld in a flesh-bodied, unlit form is Ra undergoing the process that the dawn requires. The diminishment is not a crisis, it is the mechanism. The vulnerability of the night form is what makes the morning's emergence possible. The sun retreating into a state of potential, of seed-like latency, from which the full radiance of the new day can be generated. This is why the bark's crew matters as much as it does. Ra, traveling in this diminished form, cannot navigate or protect himself as the full solar Ra might. The perception and the magical power and the pulling crews and the other beings aboard the vessel are not supplementary assistance for a figure who could manage without them if he preferred. They are constitutively necessary for the journey's success. Without Sia's perception reading the dark ahead, without Heka's power empowering the words that must be spoken, without the tow rope crews pulling the vessel across the terrain, the bark cannot cross on its own. The regeneration fails, the dawn does not come, the cycle breaks. The sense of mutual necessity that the bark establishes, Ra needing the crew oriented entirely toward Ra's successful passage, is one of the more interesting features of the Duat's cosmology. The solar journey is not a solo achievement of divine force. It is a collaborative undertaking distributed across many figures performing many specific functions, the whole arrangement only workable if every component is present and doing exactly what it is supposed to do. The night is a work undertaken by many beings together. In the tomb paintings at KV-34, the burial chamber of Thutmose III, the bark appears in register after register as the Duat's 12 hours unfold across the walls. The same vessel, depicted with the same characteristic proportions and the same crew configuration, moving through landscapes that change around it while it remains constant. The water gives way to sand. The sand gives way to something harder and stranger. The inhabitants of each hour line the registers on either side, and in the center of the painted world, through all of it, the bark moves. There is a quality in this repetition, the bark appearing again and again in successive panels, always recognizably itself, that communicates something the individual hour-by-hour descriptions alone cannot quite convey. The Duat changes. Each hour brings its own specific geography, its own inhabitants, its own conditions and requirements, but the bark is constant. It enters each new region as itself, carrying its same crew in the same positions, bearing off-Ra at its center through every kind of terrain the underworld presents. Whatever the particular hour requires, water or sand or darkness deeper than the last, the vessel continues. This quality of steady continuation through changing conditions is not incidental to the theological meaning of the Duat. The point is not the drama of any individual encounter, not the strangeness of any particular hour's landscape, not the specific challenge of any single crossing. The point is that the crossing is completed, that the bark, night after night, enters the Duat at sunset and exits it at dawn. That Afra enters the underworld in a flesh-bodied, unlit form and emerges from it at the eastern horizon in the full radiance of the morning sun. The Duat is a document of a process that works, that has worked every night since the first night, that will work every night after. The specific makeup of the bark's crew varied in some details between different versions of the Duat and between different periods of Egyptian religious history. There were other figures who appeared in various registers, Thoth with his recording palette, specific protective deities, the souls of the blessed dead, who in some accounts accompanied the bark as participants, rather than as passive inhabitants of the Duat's regions. The core positions, though, Sia at the prow, Heka among the crew, Ra in his night form at the vessel's center, remained consistent across the tradition's long span. These were the non-negotiable presences, the ones without whom the configuration of the night journey could not function. Other beings aboard the bark in various Duat depictions included figures whose specific functions related to the protective dimensions of the passage. The night journey, while not conceived primarily as a continuous combat, moved through territories with genuine hazards, beings and forces whose presence required response, regions whose particular character demanded specific forms of attention. The crew was assembled not for a comfortable transit, but for the actual conditions of the Duat, which varied, and which were, in some of their hours, genuinely difficult to traverse. A crew constituted for calm water would not suffice for all 12 hours. The bark carried what the full journey required. What the bark carried, at its most fundamental level, was the possibility of mourning. This is the frame within which everything else about the vessel and its crew makes sense. The Nesectet, Waiting at the western horizon at sunset is not receiving a passenger, it is receiving a process, an ongoing cosmic event, and taking on the responsibility of carrying that process through the night without interruption. Everything on the vessel is oriented toward the moment at the eastern horizon when the regenerated sun appears above the desert and the new day begins. The journey's 12 hours are not 12 separate events, they are 12 stages of a single transformation. The tow rope, in this understanding, is not merely a practical means of moving a vessel across terrain. It cannot cross on its own. It is a feature of the night's collaborative structure, the specific image of divine beings, underworld beings, the blessed dead, leaning forward into the dark and pulling the sun toward morning, their bodies angled forward, their weight committed to the rope, the vessel moving across sand because they are moving with it. This image, the crew at work in the darkness, pulling, appears in the Duat's registers with a plainness that makes it easy to read past. It is not dramatic. It is not ornamented. It is simply depicted as what happens when the water ends and the terrain changes, and the work of the crossing must be done by other means. The Egyptians painted this image on the walls of royal tombs because the dead king, in their theological understanding, was expected to participate in this journey himself, to travel with the solar bark through the 12 hours of the Duat, to be present in the registers as a being of the underworld, to experience the regeneration that the night passage brought. The tomb was not a resting place in the simple sense of a place where a body lies still. It was understood as the entrance to a passage, the western threshold of a journey that ran through the dark and emerged on the other side as the dawn. The paintings on the walls were not decoration. They were the map the dead king would need and the company he would keep. The bark's consistency in those registers, appearing in panel after panel, always the same vessel, always in motion, always crewed, served a specific function for the tomb's royal occupant. It meant that wherever in the Duat the king found himself, the bark was findable. Its position was known, its crew was named and depicted. The tow rope was visible, extending forward into whatever came next. Nothing in the journey, even the hours where the terrain shifted and the waterway disappeared and the darkness deepened beyond what any living eye could imagine, placed the bark beyond reach or beyond recognition. It was always there, always moving, always carrying what it had taken on responsibility for carrying. And at the front of it, in every hour, through every kind of darkness and every kind of terrain, Sia stands at the prow with his scroll. The figure of perception, eyes forward, facing the next region before the bark enters it, not alarmed, not braced against whatever is coming, simply attentive, the specific, steady attentiveness of a figure whose function is to see clearly, who has been seeing clearly for every night the bark has made this passage, who will continue seeing clearly in every night that follows. The scroll in his hands, the darkness ahead, his eyes open. The Mesektet is a ship made for a specific passage. Its crew is assembled for the particular requirements of a 12-hour journey through a country that is navigable by water in some of its regions and not in others, that requires different things at different hours, that presents conditions no single figure or single form of preparation could be adequate to meet alone. It is a vessel constituted for completion, built, crewed, and positioned at the western horizon every evening because the journey it carries has never yet failed to arrive at the dawn, and the beings who crew it have never yet failed to do what the particular hour required. At sunset, the transfer between the two barks occurs at the flat line, where the desert and the sky meet, Ross in his night form takes his position at the vessel's center. Sia at the prow faces forward into the dark. Heka takes his place among the crew, the power that makes words operative, settling into its position among the assembled company. The tow rope lies in the vessel's bow, coiled and slack for now, waiting for the hours when the water will end and the work of pulling will begin. The western gateway opens, the bark enters the first of the 12 named regions of the Duat. Behind it, the last light of the day closes, and the night has begun, and the journey that carries morning through the dark is already underway. Somewhere in the hours ahead, on the dry terrain of one of the Duat's inner regions, the rope will go taut. The crew assigned to that hour will lean forward, their weight against the line, the bark beginning to move across the sand. The steady pull of beings doing the particular work they exist to do, in the dark, without ceremony, because the morning is on the other side of it, and always has been. At the western edge of the world, in the oldest accounts of the Egyptian tradition, there stands a guarded gateway. It is a threshold, not a wall, a passage between the visible and the invisible, between the sky the sun has just crossed and the region beneath the earth that waits to receive him. The doorkeeper stationed here has a name. The inhabitants arranged on either side of the waterway have names. The corridor beyond has a name, Wernus, and into this named, administered, carefully mapped place, Ra's bark moves now through the last diminishing light of the western horizon, the darkness of the Duat closing gently around it as it passes through. The first hour of the night journey begins, in the Amduat's account, not with silence and emptiness, but with a reception. Dozens of figures line the waterway inside Wernus, gods of the outer corridor, blessed souls, beings whose function in this region is specifically welcoming. Their postures in the painted registers of the Amduat face inward toward the central waterway, toward the approaching bark, their arms raised in the formal gesture that Egyptian tomb paintings reserved for greeting and recognition. The figures on the left and right walls face each other across the water, forming a corridor of acknowledgement through which the solar vessel moves. It is the quality of a formal arrival, not a triumph and not a trial, but the received passage of something expected and attended to, the underworld's first hour already in order and already waiting. The waterway of Wernus runs straight. The bark moves along it at the pace that tow ropes determine, steady, continuous, the pull of those ahead keeping the vessel from stalling in the dark. Ro travels in the form the tradition calls Auf-Ra, the sun as flesh rather than the sun as light, a diminished and quiet presence at the center of the vessel, surrounded by his crew, moving through a country whose inhabitants know him even in this diminished state. The welcoming gods of Wernus call out to him as he passes. The Amduat's texts record what they say, words of reception, words acknowledging the sun's arrival, words that confirm the bark has entered the night passage correctly and will be guided forward. Then the first hour ends. The bark passes beyond the welcoming corridor, and the second region of the Duat opens before it. The second and third hours carry the bark along the underworld waterway, through regions that the Amduat names and populates with their own specific inhabitants, fields and their cultivating gods, granaries and the divine overseers of provision, the blessed dead, and the beings who tend to them in the growing darkness of the Duat's middle hours. These are not empty spaces between more significant events. The tradition treats them with the same attentive care it brings to every other region of the night journey, cataloging the figures present in each register, recording the words spoken between Ra and the beings he passes. The bark moves through a populated country. Everywhere there are gods performing the work that defines their presence here, gods whose function is specific to this hour and this region, and who cannot simply be moved to serve elsewhere. The underworld in the Amduat's presentation is not a vague and unstructured darkness. It is administered. Every hour has been arranged. The fields of the third hour hold the dead in something resembling the fields they knew in life. Rectangular plots of land tended by divine cultivators, irrigation channels maintained by gods, whose task is the provision of the blessed. The Amduat's accounts describe grain of divine scale, orchards and water, the generous maintenance of those who have passed correctly through death's threshold, and arrived in a region whose landscape still holds a distant, transformed likeness of the living world. The bark moves along the waterway that runs through these fields, and the gods who tend them acknowledge its passage, and the hour completes itself in that acknowledgement, and the fourth hour begins. In the fourth hour something changes. The waterway ends. Not gradually, not with any prior indication, the channel of navigable water that has carried the bark through the first 3 hours simply stops, giving way to a new kind of terrain entirely. The painted registers of the Amduat show the transition without ceremony. Water, and then, in the following register, sand. The landscape becomes the dry, level, boundless territory that the tradition calls Rosetto. This is the domain of Sokar, one of Egypt's oldest funerary deities, a hawk-headed god whose authority over the dead predates the Amduat itself, whose cavern sits at the deepest and most lightless point of the underworld. The bark cannot move here on water because there is no water. It cannot move under its own power because the current that carried it through the first 3 hours is gone, and so the tow rope crews lean forward into their work across the dry terrain, drawing the vessel across a distance that the tradition describes as impenetrable in its darkness. The darkness of Rosé is not the ordinary darkness of the night. The Amduat's texts describe it as a place beyond the reach of any ordinary illumination, not simply dark, but the absolute form of darkness, the darkness that existed before Ra ever rose, the darkness that is the territory's defining condition. In this darkness, in the fourth hour, there is one source of something like light. A fire-breathing serpent called Kaidi moves through the region, and what comes from its open mouth is not the soft illumination of lamplight, but a harsh and functional brightness that allows the tow rope crews to see the path across the sand. It is not warmth. It is the specific fire of a creature whose nature is fire, providing just enough visibility for the bark to continue. The crews draw the vessel forward. Keti moves ahead of them in the dark. Upper South, the fourth hour, passes through Rosetta in this fashion, pulled rather than sailed, lit by fire rather than sun, crossing ground that holds no water and provides no ordinary comfort, and yet crossing it correctly, crossing it completely, arriving at the other side. The fifth hour opens on something hidden, deep in the territory of Rosto, below even the level at which Keti's fire illuminates the passage. There is a cavern. Sokar stands within it. The Amduat's registers show him on a mound, a low, contained elevation at the center of the cavern floor, with sphinxes standing on either side of him in absolute stillness. The cavern is not a room that other things move through. It is a sealed and motionless space, the deepest point of the entire night journey, the furthest reach of the underworld's interior. Sokar stands on his mound and does not move. The sphinxes do not move. The darkness of the cavern is described in the tradition as complete. No Keti here, no tow rope fire, nothing that provides illumination, the darkness pressing in equally from every direction, with no gradation and no edge. And yet, nested within this darkness, within this deepest and most lightless point of the Duat's 12 hours, something is present that is not visible even to most of the underworld's own inhabitants. The scarab form of the sun, Khepri, the god who carries the image of perpetual self-generation, the dawn in its potential form, rests hidden inside Sokar's mound. The seed of the coming morning exists here, at the midnight of the underworld, at the moment and place furthest from any horizon. The Duat's account treats this fact with the matter-of-fact precision that characterizes its entire presentation. Khepri is here. Khepri is not visible. The ordinary dead cannot perceive him. The sphinxes do not look toward him. Sokar stands above the mound with no expression. The painted registers can convey, keeping his cavern the way he has always kept it, and the sun's morning form waits below him in the dark, present but not yet ready to announce itself. The Rhea and Osiris who meet in this fifth hour are not two beings encountering each other across a distance. The tradition describes something more intimate than a meeting and more surprising than a merger, a brief, mutual recognition in which the solar and the chthonic become, for the duration of this deepest hour, the same entity. Ra carries the living force that animates all things in the world above. Osiris carries the regenerative power of the earth, and the dead, the capacity for transformation that the underworld holds in concentrated form. What one brings, the other needs. What each one is, the other becomes. The texts of the Duat describe the soul of Ra as Osiris, and the soul of Osiris as Ra, the two identities exchanging what makes each one what it is. This exchange happens in the dark, in the cavern's hour, attended only by the motionless sphinxes and the hidden scarab nested in the mound below. Then, the hour completes, the bark moves forward, Sokar remains in his cavern. The fifth hour gives way to the sixth. The sixth hour carries the bark through a region that the tradition associates with what the dead require for passage: the correct words, the correct names, the knowledge of each gate's guardian, and each guardian's demand. The figures who populate the sixth hour's registers are gatekeepers and record keepers, beings whose function is the maintenance of the boundary between one hour and the next, between one region of the Duat and the region that follows it. Thoth moves in this territory with his reed pen and his palette, recording the passage of the hours in the dark, his ibis head tilted toward the text he is producing. The record of the journey is being made while the journey is underway. The divine author of the Duat's own account, in some versions of the tradition, is here as witness and recorder of precisely the events his words describe, traveling through the book he wrote. The sixth hour also holds a quality that the Duat's registers convey through their arrangement, more than through their text. The journey is past its midpoint. The descent is complete. The bark has reached the deep interior of the Duat, and now, through the remaining hours, begins its long movement back towards something that will eventually become the eastern horizon, the dawn, the return of Ra to the visible sky. This is not yet apparent in the landscape, which remains the dark and administered territory of the underworld's interior regions. But the structure of the Duat's 12-hour sequence holds this midpoint as real and meaningful. The passage through the fifth hour's deepest cavern was the center, and everything from here moves, however slowly and indirectly, toward its opposite. The seventh hour is the battle. In the context of the night journey's full 12-hour arc, it arrives precisely where the tradition places it, past the midpoint, in the hour when the bark has moved through the deepest regions and is making its way toward the Duat's upper levels, and when Apophis chooses his obstruction. The great serpent lies across the underworld waterway in a coil that fills the corridor from wall to painted wall, his body a geological fact rather than an animal action, the waterway blocked not by attack but by presence. The tow rope goes slack, the bark stops, the hour holds its still, suspended moment. Then the response comes, set at the prow, spear raised and plunged into the serpent's body, Isis with her spoken words of binding, the coordinated operation of force and ritual moving against the obstruction that Apophis embodies. The battle completes. The waterway clears. The bark moves forward into the 8th hour, and the 7th hour's enormous event settles back into the diagrammatic calm of the painted registers that record it. What the 8th hour holds is a kind of restoration. The dead who travel with the bark, those in the Duat who are temporarily frozen or suspended by Apophis's obstruction, returning to their proper conditions as the journey resumes. The registers of the 8th hour are populated with figures receiving the light that the advancing bark brings with it, the solar presence of Afra, providing even in its diminished form enough to animate what the serpent's blocking had temporarily stilled. The tradition holds that Ra's passage through each region of the Duat is not merely transit, but provision, that what the bark carries as it moves through the underworld is something the underworld's inhabitants depend on, a periodic renewal that happens once each night and sustains the dead between one transit and the next. The 8th hour's recovery of movement and animation is this provision made visible in the painted sequence, the restoration following the disruption, each region settling into its proper condition as the bark passes through. The 9th and 10th hours carry the bark through regions associated with water, the deep currents of the underworld, the domain of beings connected to what the tradition understands as the non, the primordial ocean from which all creation emerged, and within which the underworld's deepest passages run. The figures here are water gods and river gods, beings whose long, sinuous bodies move through the registers in configurations that mirror the waterway. The bark travels. The darkness is still complete, the only illumination what the bark itself provides, but the quality of the terrain has shifted from the absolute dryness of Rostath back to something navigable and fluid. The 10th hour is also the hour in which the solar eye begins its restoration. The Eye of Ra, the luminous, protective emanation of the sun, a force that the tradition treats as a distinct being capable of its own movement and action, was among the things diminished during Alfra's night passage through the Duat. Here, in the 10th hour, the process of its reconstitution begins. The registers show figures working at the restoration of the eye's power, the luminous force returning to something that can function as it was designed to function, the protective capacity of the sun's gaze being rebuilt within the underworld's darkness, so that it will be fully operative when Ra emerges at dawn. The tradition is precise about this. The restoration happens here, in this specific hour, carried out by the specific figures assigned to it. By the time the bark reaches the 11th hour, the eye is returned. The 11th hour opens on something that seems counterintuitive until the tradition's structure makes it comprehensible. Stars are depicted in the Amduat's registers for this hour, but not stars as they appear in the night sky, visible and already present in the visible world. These are stars in the process of being reanimated. The tradition holds that what appears in the sky above the living world at night is the emergence of what has been prepared below, inside the earth, in the Duat's interior. The stars do not simply exist in the sky. They rise from the inside of the earth outward, their reanimation happening underground before any living eye could see them. In the 11th hour, that reanimation is underway. The stars wake within the underworld in the darkness of the Duat's penultimate hour, and by the time the 12th hour completes and Ra emerges at the eastern horizon, the stars are already in the sky to receive him. They rose from below, they were prepared in the dark. The sky the living see at dawn is the surface of what the underworld has already invisibly assembled. The 11th hour also holds figures associated with light in its preparatory forms. The light before the first light, the dawn adjacent forces that make the transition between the Duat and the visible world possible. The painted registers show beings whose function is liminal in the precise sense. They exist at and maintain the threshold between underground and sky, between the dark hour that preceded and the bright hour that follows. They are not dawn itself, they are what ensures that dawn will come. Their work in the 11th hour is quiet and specific, the final administrative preparation of the underworld before the 12th hour's transformation. Then the hour completes and the bark moves into the last region of the night. The 12th hour is the transformation hour. Its structure in the Amduat's registers is unlike any of the preceding 11 hours, and the tradition's reason for this difference is visible in the image it provides. The solar bark and all its occupants, Ra in the form of Off-Ra, the crew, the tow rope gods, the beings that have traveled with the vessel through the preceding hours, are drawn into the tail of an enormous serpent, not Apophis. This is a different serpent entirely, a being the tradition presents not as an adversary, but as a mechanism, a transformative passage through which what enters at one end emerges differently at the other. The serpent's tail receives the bark. The serpent's mouth opens at the eastern horizon. What passes through the serpent and what emerges from it are not the same. The gods who entered the serpent's tail, aged and diminished, worn by the night's passage, carrying the accumulated weight of 11 hours of transit through the Duat's administered dark, come out from the serpent's mouth young and restored. Off-Ra, the flesh form, the diminished and vulnerable traveling mode of the sun, is converted in this passage back into Ra, the fully luminous, fully empowered solar presence, the god who appears at the eastern horizon as the morning sun. The transformation is sequential in the painted registers. The Duat shows the before and after side by side on the same wall, the figures entering the tail in one condition and the figures emerging from the mouth in another, the wall itself containing both states simultaneously. The scarab Khepri is the form Ra takes at this emergence. Khepri, the self-created, the one who comes into being from himself, appears at the eastern horizon, riding the solar disk into the visible sky, the dawn form of the sun, completing the cycle that Off-Ra began at sunset. Khepri was hidden in Sokar's cavern in the 5th hour, nested in the mound at the deepest point of the journey, invisible even to most of the Duat's own inhabitants. Now he is the most visible thing in the world. The transition from hidden to manifest, from seed to risen sun, runs through the entire arc of the 12 hours, from the 5th hour's concealed scarab to the 12th hour's radiant emergence, the underground preparation, and the visible result connected across 7 hours of the Duat's interior. The eastern horizon at dawn is the endpoint of a journey that the tradition presents not as linear, but as cyclical. The bark that emerges from the serpent's mouth in the 12th hour will cross the visible sky in 12 hours of daylight, will reach the western horizon at sunset, will pass from the manjet, the day bark, to the meshektet, the night bark, and will descend again into the Duat for another 12 hours of the same journey. The Amduat's 12-hour sequence does not end at dawn. It arrives at dawn and then at sunset begins again. The journey depicted in the painted registers of KV-34's burial chamber, drawn in the spare, careful diagrammatic style that the New Kingdom tradition preferred for this text, is not the account of a single event in mythological time. It is the account of every night, a repeating structure, the same 12 hours traveled again and again, the same welcoming gods of Wernas raising their arms in the same formal reception every sunset, the same Keti illuminating the same passage across the same sand of Roseto, the same soaker standing on the same mound in the same absolute dark. The repetition is not a limitation of the tradition's imagination, it is the tradition's point. The Duat is an account of how the cosmos continues, not how it was set in motion once, but how it keeps going. Ra's successful transit through the Duat is the event that makes the next day possible. It is not a story about a god in trouble who managed to escape. It is a story about the mechanism by which morning is produced, night after night, in the same sequence, through the same 12 administered regions, by the same coordinated effort of bark crew and tow rope gods, and welcoming inhabitants and guardians and record keepers. And the morning that appears above the eastern horizon is the result of this mechanism. The tradition's careful cataloging of every figure in every register, their names, their positions, their specific functions, is the documentation of how that result is achieved. The scale of the Amduat's 12 regions, considered as a single space, is difficult to hold in mind. Each hour corresponds to a distinct geographical territory, named and populated and administered, and the 12 territories together constitute the entire underworld, the complete space beneath the earth that the living world rests upon. From Wernas in the outer corridor to Rosatao's absolute dark, to the deep currents of the 9th and 10th hours, to the liminal preparations of the 11th, and the transformative passage of the 12th, the Duat is an architecture as specific and extensive as any the ancient world conceived. And the Amduat claims to map it completely. Every figure that the bark encounters in each of the 12 hours is recorded. Every name is given. The texts beside the painted registers describe what each being says and does, what function it performs in the hour's events, what happens to those who pass through correctly and those who do not. The tradition holds the register of the journey with a quality that can be described simply as administrative confidence. There is no uncertainty in the Amduat about whether the journey is possible, no moment in which the outcome of the 12 hours is genuinely in doubt, no suggestion that Ra might not reach the eastern horizon. The journey is dangerous in specific documented ways. The darkness of Roseto, the obstruction at the 7th hour, the transitions between hours that require correct navigation, and the tradition acknowledges each danger with the same precise attention it brings to everything else. But danger in the Amduat is not the same as uncertainty. The bark is equipped, the crew is in position, the gods of each region know their function, the 12 hours have been mapped. What the map describes, correctly followed, will produce the morning. The figures of the blessed dead who appear in the Duat's various regions are among the most specific of the Amduat's cataloged presences. They are not abstractions of the afterlife state, not vague luminous souls floating in an indeterminate bliss. They are depicted in the registers as they were in life, upright, recognizable, in postures that indicate their region's particular conditions. The ones in the fields of the 3rd hour are cultivating or at rest beside their plots. The ones in the deeper hours are receiving the illumination that Ra's passing bark provides, turning toward the vessel as it moves through, dependent on that periodic light for whatever condition they maintain, between one night's transit and the next. Their relationship to Ra's journey is not incidental. They are part of what the journey is for. The bark's passage through the Duat is, among other things, the event that keeps the dead in their proper conditions, the night visit that sustains the underworld's inhabited regions until the bark returns. The painted walls of the tombs that carry the Duat's registers were understood to do something more than record the journey. The tradition held that the tomb itself was a model of the underworld, and that the words and images inscribed within it were operatively real, that the figures painted on the walls were present in the space the walls defined, that the spells and names recorded in the registers had their effect, regardless of whether a living reader was present to activate them. The tomb of Thutmose III at KV-34, with its elliptical burial chamber and its cream-colored walls covered floor to ceiling in black outlined registers, was not simply a repository for the Amduat's text. It was a constructed underworld, shaped to receive its royal inhabitant and to provide him with a mapped and administered passage through the 12 hours that the walls depicted. The dead king inside the painted chamber was, in the tradition's own terms, inside the journey the paintings described. The scroll that was unrolled around him was the map of where he was going. The oldest full version of the Duat survives in that elliptical chamber, in a room that was sealed for 3,000 years before modern entry opened it again to light and air. The spare, precise, unhurried quality of the figures painted there, stick-bodied, black outlined, arranged in their horizontal registers with the careful order of a technical diagram, has not changed in any of the centuries the tomb was closed. The welcoming gods of Vernus are still arranged along the waterway with their arms raised. Sokar still stands on his mound in the 5th hour's painted register. The sphinxes still on either side of him, the cavern around him still completely dark in the way painted darkness can be dark on a cream-colored wall in a limestone room. The 12th hour's transformation still occupies the wall at the chamber's end. The serpent, the before, the after, the mouth open at the horizon. The 12 hours have been on those walls continuously since the reign of Thutmose III. Through every night that the tomb was sealed, through every hour of daylight and darkness that passed above the limestone cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, while the painted registers inside continued to hold their figures in their positions. Every night for 3,000 years, the welcoming gods of Wernus in the painted register held their arms up. Every night Sokar stood on his mound. Every night the serpent of the 12th hour held its tail open and its mouth open, and the painted bark waited at the entrance to its transformation. The wall does not move through the hours, but the hours move through the wall, if the tradition is taken at the measure of its own claims. To read Duat from beginning to end, from the guarded gateway of Wernus, through the absolute dark of Rosé, through the midnight communion of Ra and Osiris, through the 7th hour's battle, through the star reanimating preparations of the 11th hour, through the serpent's transformative passage, is to follow a map made by people who were attempting to document something they believed was genuinely happening, not something that had happened once in mythological time and been subsequently commemorated, something that happened every night, as reliably as sunset, in the specific sequence the registers recorded, in the specific regions the registers named, attended by the specific figures the registers depicted. The map was not a metaphor. It was the map of where Rak actually went. The morning that follows is what the entire Amduat was assembled to explain. Khepri rising at the eastern horizon, young and radiant and complete, the morning sun carrying in its form the memory of the seed concealed in Sokar's cavern at the journey's deepest point, This is the end the 12 hours were building toward, and the end from which the next 12 hours of daylight will begin, and the end that will become a beginning again at sunset when the western horizon receives the bark and the Duat's guarded gateway opens for the welcoming gods of Wernus to arrange themselves once more along the waterway, arms raised, ready. The cycle turns at dawn. The eastern horizon holds the sun. The 12 hours of the night, completed and recorded and repeated, give way to the 12 hours of the day. And what the Amduat's painted walls contain settles back into the patient stillness of a room that has always been waiting for this moment and will go on waiting for the next one, the figures in their registers holding their positions in the limestone dark, the journey intact, the morning made. In the 7th hour of the night, in the painted registers of the tomb of Thutmose III, the waterway stops. The bark sits motionless in the 7th hour corridor, its tow rope slack in the water, the crew still, the forward motion that has carried Ray through 6 successive regions of the underworld suddenly arrested. Across the waterway, filling it from one edge to the other, lies the body of a serpent, so vast that the Amduat's painters rendered him at the full width of the register, a coiled mass that occupies the same space on the tomb wall that the waterway itself has occupied in every other hour, the passage simply replaced by the body of the thing that blocks it. His name in the oldest accounts is Apophis. In some versions of the tradition, he is also called Apep. Whatever name the texts use, the figure is always the same, a serpent of impossible scale, lying across the only road that Ra can travel in the only hour of the night when Ra is most diminished and the darkness is most complete. To look at the painted register of the 7th hour is to see, in the Amduat's spare and linear style, an image that requires no interpretation to be understood as significant. The waterway gone, the bark halted, the tow rope doing nothing, and ahead of it, filling the space where the water should be, the coiled geometry of a creature the texts describe as stretching to approximately 450 cubits in length, which is to say, something in the range of 230 meters, or roughly 770 feet, a body long enough to span the entire region of the 7th hour, wide enough to constitute not a creature in a landscape, but a landscape in itself. The scale is worth staying with. The Amduat is not describing a large snake. It is describing something closer in proportion to a geological feature, a range of low hills seen from a distance, or the course of a river before it reaches a delta, something so far beyond the ordinary dimensions of a living thing that the category of creature does not quite hold it. The Egyptian theological mind that produced this description was not reaching for the superlative. It was locating Apophis precisely, making a structural argument about the kind of thing this was and the kind of problem it posed. A serpent of 450 cubits is not an animal that can be managed. It is a condition. The condition has a name in the Egyptian theological vocabulary. Isfet is the word the tradition uses. Disorder, chaos, the active principle of non-being that preceded creation and continued to press against the ordered world the gods had made. Rot embodies its opposite. His passage through the night is itself a maintenance of the world's structure, the sun completing its cycle, the morning coming again, the seasons held in their proper sequence, the Nile rising when it should. Without Ra's passage, there is no morning. Without the morning, the ordered world unmakes itself back into what existed before creation. This is not a mythological exaggeration. It is, within the Egyptian theological frame, the most precise description available of what Apophis represents and what is actually at stake in the 7th hour. The tradition is careful to distinguish this from a moral conflict. Apophis is not evil in the way that later theological traditions would use that word, not a rebel, not a fallen figure, not a being who chose wrongly and was corrupted by that choice. He is, in the Amduat's account, the embodiment of what was before creation and what seeks to be again. He does not want anything in the sense that creatures with intentions want things. He presses against creation because pressing against creation is what he is. The conflict between Ra and Apophis is structural. It repeats because it must repeat, because the condition Apophis embodies has not been eliminated, cannot be eliminated, and each night brings Ra back through the seventh hour and back into proximity with the force that would undo everything the sun's passage holds in order. What the painted register shows, in the precise and diagrammatic lines of the Amduat's visual language, is the moment just before the response begins, the bark halted, the body of Apophis filling the waterway, the crew arranged in their positions. And at the prow, or in the water beside the vessel, the accounts vary slightly here, as the accounts of any detail in a tradition transmitted across centuries and through multiple scribal hands tend to vary. The figure of Set, with his spear. Set is a god whose nature the Egyptian tradition understood with considerable precision. The god of storms, of the desert, of violence and disruptive force. Set is not a gentle deity, and the tradition never presents him as one. He inhabits the margins of the ordered world the other gods maintain, and his nature is adversarial, willful, given to excess. In the Assyrian mythological cycle, Set is the figure who dismembers his brother. In the long legal contest between Set and Horus, he is the disputant, whose claims the divine tribunal struggles to adjudicate, whose rights are real, but whose methods are ungovernable. Set is, in the broadest terms the Egyptian tradition would recognize, something very close to the kind of force the cosmos would prefer to keep at its edges. In the seventh hour, his nature becomes precisely the right tool for the task at hand. What can confront a force of chaos is not order. Order has no purchase on Apophis, because Apophis is what preceded order, what exists outside the frame that order established. The gods of divine law, the gods of careful measurement and correct procedure, they have nothing to bring to this encounter that Apophis's nature would recognize as relevant. Set, whose violence is itself a kind of chaos, whose force operates outside the careful categories of divine order, whose nature is as ungovernable and excessive as the serpent's. Set is the one figure in the bark's company who can meet Apophis on ground that Apophis understands. His spear, in the seventh hour register, is not a weapon of law. It is a force of disruption applied against the most profound disruption imaginable. In this hour, what holds the cosmos together is the precise deployment of the right kind of wrongness against the wrong thing. The spear enters the body of Apophis in the Amduat's register with the same calm, unhurried linearity that the painting uses for everything else. There is no visual drama in the Amduat style, no distortion of form to suggest violence, no deviation from the horizontal register that all figures occupy, no special treatment of this moment to distinguish it from the depiction of tow rope crews moving across sand. The spear is in the body is coiled across the waterway. Set stands in his position, and his posture is the posture of a figure doing the specific work for which he is precisely suited. The tomb painters of the New Kingdom rendered the confrontation with the same precision they used to render the welcoming gods of the first hour, the same spare outlines, the same clear spatial arrangement, the same patient diagrammatic accuracy. Set's spear does not complete the work alone. The seventh hour is a coordinated operation, and the Duat presents it as such, several forces working simultaneously, each contributing something the others cannot provide, the combined effort constituting what the tradition understands as sufficient for the serpent's defeat. Alongside Set's physical assault, two other figures apply their particular capacities to the problem. Selkis, the scorpion goddess, a deity closely associated with the management of venom and the neutralization of destructive forces, brings her authority to bear on Apophis's body. Her function is binding and sealing, to immobilize the regenerative force of the serpent, to neutralize the aspect of Apophis that would reconstitute itself even as Set's spear divides his coils. Selkis's power is older than most of the gods in the Bark's company, rooted in a tradition of magical management that the Egyptian priesthood associated with the deep knowledge of dangerous things, the knowledge that does not keep its distance from what it neutralizes, but must enter into proximity with it, must understand what it seals before it can seal it effectively. In the seventh hour, Selkis applies that knowledge to the largest and most fundamental dangerous thing in the underworld, her power working on the body of Apophis, while Set's violence holds his attention. Isis speaks. The specific content of what Isis says in the seventh hour is preserved in the Duat texts in a form that ancient Egyptian magical practice understood as genuinely operational, not a description of binding, but the binding itself. Words functioning as real force on the body and nature of Apophis. The Egyptian understanding of what words could do was not metaphorical. A correctly spoken word, in the right ritual context by a figure with the right authority, performed an actual change in the world, or in this case, in the underworld, not a symbolic representation of that change. What Isis says in the seventh hour stops Apophis from moving in the same way that Set's spear stops him from uncoiling. The verbal and the physical are not different categories of action in this tradition. They are the same action conducted through two different available channels. The three-part response, Set's spear, Selkis's sealing, Isis's spoken words, is depicted in the Duat seventh hour register in the calm, simultaneous arrangement of the tomb painter's visual grammar. Physical force and ritual authority occupy the same horizontal band of the composition, laid out side by side in the precise, unhurried style that the Duat uses throughout. No element of the response is presented as primary. No element is presented as supplementary. The tradition holds them as equally necessary components of a single act, each one insufficient on its own, all three together adequate to what the hour requires. Adequate, it is worth noting, is not the same as permanent. The deepest structural feature of the Apophis encounter, the one that the Duat does not dramatize, but simply states, as a condition of the cosmological order it describes, is that the defeat of Apophis in the seventh hour does not eliminate Apophis. The serpent is not killed. He cannot be killed because the force he embodies cannot be destroyed without destroying the structure of creation itself. Isfet is not a creature to be slain and removed from the world. It is the primordial condition against which the ordered world exists, the ongoing pressure of non-being against the boundary that creation established. Defeating Apophis means temporarily disabling him, coiling his body into restraint, silencing the force of his movement, allowing Ra's passage to continue through the seventh hour corridor, while the serpent is held immobile by Set's violence and Selkis's sealing and Isis's words. By the following night, Apophis will have reconstituted. The coils will have uncoiled. The seventh hour will contain him again, filling the waterway from edge to edge. And the bark will halt again, and Set will raise his spear again, and Isis will speak again, and Selkis will bind again, and the waterway will clear again, and Ra will pass again. This is not presented in the Duat as a tragic condition. The tradition does not describe the repetition as a failure or a flaw in creation's design. The seventh hour is simply one of the 12 hours through which Ra must pass, and the battle it contains is simply one of the features of the seventh hour, as the waterway is a feature of the first, and the sand is a feature of the fourth. The cosmos requires this. The maintenance of the world is not a one-time accomplishment, but a nightly process, and the defeat of Apophis is part of what that process involves. Each morning that Ra appears at the eastern horizon is evidence that the seventh hour confrontation went as it was supposed to go. The provisional quality of the victory is not a problem, it is the structure. What the Egyptian priesthood drew from this understanding was practical. If the cosmos required a nightly confrontation with Isfet in order to maintain itself, and if the cosmic confrontation had a precise form and a documented procedure, then the human analog of that confrontation, the ritual performance conducted by living priests in the hours of darkness above the ground, had real work to do, not symbolic work, actual maintenance. The Bremner Rind Papyrus, a late-period document that preserves a remarkable collection of spells directed against Apophis, records the ritual procedures in detail, the recitation of specific texts, the preparation of effigies, the physical acts that the priests performed in the dark of the temple while the underground battle they mirrored was underway. The spells in the Bremner Rind Papyrus address Apophis directly, in the second person, with the authority of figures who know his names and his natures and his points of vulnerability. To know the name of Apophis, to know all his names, the full inventory of what the tradition had assigned him across centuries of theological elaboration, was to have some purchase on what he was. The Egyptian magical understanding held that a thing's name was part of its nature, not merely a label attached to it from outside. To speak Apophis's names correctly was to enact a small portion of the binding that Isis performed in the underworld, to participate in the coordination that the seventh hour required, to add one's own voice to the ongoing maintenance of the world's ordered structure. The physical acts the Bremner Rind Papyrus prescribes are careful and specific. A figure of Apophis, prepared from papyrus or wax, is held over a flame. The act of burning is understood as a genuine attack on the serpent's body, not a representation of harm, but harm itself, conducted at the level of the underlying reality that the effigy corresponds to. The ritual also involves acts of trampling, of spitting, of verbal repudiation, each one a precision instrument for a specific aspect of what Apophis is and what he does. The priests who performed these rituals night after night in the great temples, at Karnak most prominently, where the documentation is richest, where the ritual calendar preserved in the temple's inscriptions shows the Apophis rites maintained as a regular feature of the nightly ceremonial, were not, in their own understanding, performing symbolic gestures of piety. They were doing the necessary maintenance. The image of the Karnak priest with the wax effigy has a particular quality to it. In the enormous columned darkness of the temple, the night air outside, carrying the particular dry coolness of the Nile Valley, the city quiet, the sleeping world unconscious of what its continuation required, a single figure holding a small wax shape over a small flame, speaking specific words in a specific order, completing a set of ritual actions that had been performed the same way the night before and would be performed the same way the following night. The flame is small. The serpent it opposes is 450 cubits long. The priest is a single human being. The tradition makes no apology for this disproportion. It holds without evident strain that the small flame and the spoken words are genuinely adequate to the function they serve, that the connection between the ritual act and the cosmological event is real, that the wax figure and the great body of Apophis lying across the seventh hour waterway are the same thing viewed from two different distances. The ritual texts directed against Apophis are among the most specific and procedurally detailed documents in the surviving Egyptian religious corpus. They are not prayers in the sense of petitions to a higher authority. They are operational instructions for a process that the tradition understood to be as reliable as any other correctly performed procedure: the smelting of copper, the setting of a broken bone, the measurement of a field after the flood. If the words are spoken in the right order, by the right person, with the right preparation of the effigy, the result follows. The cosmos is, in this respect, a machine that can be operated by those who know its operating procedures. The priests who maintained the nightly Apophis rite were not hoping that their actions would help. They knew the actions would help because the tradition had documented that they always had. There is something restful in this, viewed from a sufficient distance. The Egyptian theological world was not one in which the preservation of order required vigilance and the sense of anxious uncertainty about the outcome. The battle of the seventh hour had been won every previous night, would be won the following night, would go on being won as long as the bark moved and the crew held their positions, and Set raised his spear, and Isis spoke her words, and Selkis applied her knowledge to the body of what she sealed. The priests at Karnak were not standing watch against a possible failure. They were participants in a process whose outcome, properly maintained, was reliable. The nightly burning of the effigy was less like a desperate defense and more like tending a lamp, the right action performed at the right time by the person whose function it was, the flame going on doing what a correctly tended flame does. What the surviving texts make clear, in the accumulated detail of their ritual instructions and theological explanations, is that the Egyptian understanding of cosmic maintenance was thoroughly collaborative. The gods fought in the underworld. The priests enacted the corresponding ritual on the surface. The dead within the Duat contributed their own presences to the cosmological balance. The living who commissioned the spells, who paid for the preparation of the effigies, who ensured that the correct papyri were in the temple's possession, they too were part of the structure. The maintenance of the world was not something that happened to the living while they slept. It was something the living participated in through the institutions they built, and the knowledge they preserved, and the rituals they funded, and the priests they trained. The cosmos needed human hands. The Bremner Rind Papyrus is, among other things, the documentation of what those hands were supposed to do. Among the features of the Apophis rite that the Bremner Rind Papyrus preserves is the enumeration of Apophis's names. The tradition accumulated these names across centuries, each one expressing a different aspect of what Apophis was and what he did, names for his length, his nature, his relationship to the primordial water, his opposition to light, his occupation of the seventh hour corridor. To recite the names in ritual was to demonstrate the knowledge that the magical tradition held as the precondition for effective action. One could not bind something one did not know. One could not speak the words of restraint without knowing what one was restraining. The accumulated naming of Apophis in the Bremner Rin texts reads less like an invocation and more like an inventory, a careful, detailed catalog of the thing that must be managed, drawn up by people who had thought about it with sustained and precise attention across many generations. That sustained attention is itself one of the more interesting features of the Egyptian relationship to Apophis. The tradition did not resolve the problem by eliminating it. It did not, over the centuries, theologize Apophis into something manageable or lesser. did not reduce him to a merely local hazard or reframe his defeat as final and accomplished. The great serpent lay across the seventh hour waterway every night, as vast and as fundamental as he had ever been, and every night the same response was mounted, and the same outcome was achieved, and the same priests burned the same effigy, and spoke the same words, and the same morning came. The Quashester tradition found in repetition, not frustration, but structure. The cosmos was not a problem to be solved once. It was a relationship to be maintained indefinitely by the living and the dead and the divine, all of them doing their specific part, all of it necessary, none of it finally sufficient on its own. In the Duat's sixth hour, immediately before the encounter with Apophis, the registers show the underworld river running through a region where the dead are beginning to be reconstituted, where the processes of restoration that will eventually carry Ray through to the dawn are just becoming visible. There is a specific sequence logic to the Duat that the tomb painters understood and expressed through the arrangement of the hours. The deepest darkness comes after the first preparations for return. The most fundamental confrontation is placed exactly at the midpoint of the night's 12 hours, and the outcome of that confrontation, Apophis temporarily disabled, the waterway cleared, the tow rope going taut again, enables everything that follows. The gradual restoration of Ra's luminous form across the 8th, ninth, 10th, and 11th hours. The final transformation of the 12th. The morning that all of it was oriented toward. The 7th hour is, in this structure, the hinge. It is the point at which the night's direction reverses. Not immediately, not obviously, but in principle. The bark halted before Apophis is the furthest point from the dawn. The spear entering the body of the serpent is the first movement back. By the time the tow rope tightens and the crew leans into their work again, the night is still dark, the waterways still winding through the underworld's named and specific regions, Ra still in the diminished flesh form he travels in. But the hinge has turned. The direction has changed. What follows the 7th hour is all, in the theological logic of the Duat, consequence of the battle having gone as it was supposed to go. The painting on the tomb wall at KV 34 shows all of this in the horizontal registers of the elliptical chamber, the hours arranged in sequence around the walls, the 7th hour occupying its precise position in the circuit. The viewer standing in the burial chamber and turning to take in all 12 hours at once would see in the spare black outlines of the New Kingdom funerary style the entire night laid out, the welcoming gods of the first hour, the waterway of the second, the sand of the fourth, the cavern of the fifth, and then the seventh. Apophis coiled across the corridor, the spear in his coils, set in his position, Isis with her words, Selkis with her sealing. The bark halted, and then, in the registers of the 8th hour, on the adjacent wall, moving again. The chamber itself is the book, the walls are the pages. The dead king at the center of the room is the reader, or perhaps more precisely, the figure for whom the reading matters, the one whose own passage through the night's 12 hours. The text describes, and in describing enables. The wax effigy burns in the priest's hands in the Karnak temple. The flame is small. The room around it is very large and very dark. Outside the temple, the Nile moves in the direction it always moves. The fields beside it, quiet in the dark. The city asleep, the stars in the positions they occupy in this particular hour of the night. Somewhere below the surface of the desert, in the theological geography that the Duat describes with such precise and patient care, the 7th hour corridor holds the body of Apophis lying across the waterway, and the bark is halted before him, and the response is underway. Set spear. Isis's words, Selkis's sealing. The same three forces in the same positions they have always occupied, doing the same work they have always done. The priest completes the recitation. He holds the wax over the flame until it softens and changes shape, the effigy losing its form in the heat. The words spoken that the Bremner Rind papyrus prescribes for this moment, words directed at Apophis by his accumulated names, words that assert the victory that the seventh hour battle achieves, words that perform at the level of the ritual act above ground, the binding that Isis performs in the underworld. The flame does its small, warm, precise work. The papyrus holds the words that the tradition has carried from one generation of priests to the next, from one copying to another, from the royal tombs of the New Kingdom through the centuries to this room, this night, this particular maintenance of the structure the cosmos requires. And the maintenance holds. The morning will come, the bark will clear the seventh hour corridor and move through the remaining hours, the restoration of Ra's luminous form, proceeding hour by hour in the underworld's specific and named geography. The great serpent immobilized in the seventh hour corridor, while the night continues its work without him. The priests who maintained this rite for century after century in the temples along the Nile, in the great columned darkness of Karnak, where the documentation of the ritual is richest, in the smaller sanctuaries and the private funerary installations of those wealthy enough to commission the correct preparations, they were not performing a ceremony whose efficacy they doubted. They were tending the lamp. The lamp required tending. The cosmos required the lamp. The wax serpent burned in the priest's hands, and the small warm light of the flame held steady in the dark. And somewhere beneath the desert, the seventh hour battle went exactly as it always had, and the world held its shape, and the morning gathered itself at the eastern edge of the sky, waiting for the bark to complete what the seventh hour had made possible. The Bremner Rind papyrus survives. It sits in a museum now, its papyrus brittle and its ink darkened to brown, its columns of hieratic script still carrying the words that the priests spoke in the dark of the Karnak temple for centuries. The serpent it names is still named in it. The ritual instructions are still there, still specific, still procedural. The preparation of the effigy, the words to be spoken, the order in which the acts are to be performed, the names of Apophis enumerated in their catalog. The document is not operational in the way its authors intended. No priest holds the wax over the flame in response to its instructions now, but the instructions remain, laid out in the careful hand of the scribes who copied them, in the same patient and precise style that the Duat painters used on the walls of KV 34. The same unhurried attention to detail, the same confidence that the record of what the tradition knew was worth preserving exactly, the same sense that the maintenance of correct knowledge was itself a form of maintenance of the world. In the seventh hour register of the tomb of Thutmose III, the body of Apophis fills the waterway from one edge to the other, and the bark sits motionless before him, and the spear is raised, and the tow rope lies slack in the dark. Every night that the king was in his tomb, and the new kingdom dead were understood to travel with Ra through the underworld, their presence in the burial chamber, not a confinement, but a participation in the night's passage. The walls showed the same image, the same hour, the same great coiled body filling the painted corridor with its 450 cubit length. The king lay at the center of the book. The book was painted on the walls around him. The seventh hour was always there, always in its position, always the hinge of the night's 12 hours, always showing the bark halted, and the spear raised, and the three-part response already underway. The cosmos required this. The tradition said so. The priests performed the corresponding ritual every night in the great dark temples. The small wax serpent burned in the small careful flame. The words were spoken in the right order by the right people with the right preparation, and the morning came again, as it always had, as the Duat said it would. The eastern horizon brightening with the light of Iraq, who had passed through the seventh hour and come out the other side, not unscathed, not without the cost of the confrontation, but through it and past it, and still in motion, the bark moving again, the tow rope taut, the remaining hours of the night opening one by one before the prow, the crew in their positions, the dawn ahead. Hathor stands at the edge of the western horizon beside a sycamore tree, and the branches of that tree extend outward over the arriving dead. The light behind her is the last light there is. What comes after her, what opens behind her and extends downward into the dark, is a country too wide and too old for any single name to contain it, and she stands at its entrance with water and food and the quiet authority of someone who has been waiting at this threshold since the first night the sun ever went down. The sycamore tree, in the Egyptian tradition, was understood to be a place where the boundary between one kind of existence and another became thin. In tomb paintings and funerary papyri across many centuries of Egyptian religious art, Hathor, in her aspect as Lady of the West, emerges from the trunk or stands beneath the canopy of the sycamore, offering sustenance to the newly arrived dead, with a gesture that is both welcome and acknowledgement, a recognition that what has arrived is real, that the passage has genuinely been made, that the dead belong here now in the way that the living had once belonged to the world above. The tree's branches reach over figures who are already turned away from everything they had known, and what she holds out to them is water, which in a land of desert was always more than water. It was the confirmation that what came next was not only dark, it was also in its way inhabited. The Egyptian underworld, the Duat, which the tradition describes as existing beneath the earth and within the body of the night sky simultaneously, was not a place of emptiness. This is what the oldest sources insist on, and what the figures painted on tomb walls across 3,000 years of Egyptian religion make visually undeniable. The Duat was full, it was administered, it was governed by presences of enormous age and specific function, each one keeping the hour or the region or the threshold that had always been theirs to keep. Among those presences, Hathor at the western entrance was the first the dead encountered, the one who received them, whose tree provided the last familiar comfort before the full strangeness of the Duat's geography opened ahead. Her welcome was not conditional. It did not depend on the righteousness of the dead or on the outcome of any judgment. The judgment came later, in its own place, administered by its own authorities. What Hathor offered was, prior to all of that, a moment of reception before the reckoning, a cup of water held out at the door of a very old and very large house, the branches of the sycamore spreading over everyone who arrived, regardless of what they were carrying. The warmth of the image is specific and deliberate. The Egyptians did not design the entrance to the underworld to be cold. Anubis stands at a gateway deeper inside. The jackal-headed god is still upright and precise, one of 12 such figures stationed at 12 successive thresholds within the Duat, each one a threshold that the dead must pass through in sequence, each one requiring something from whoever approaches. What is required is knowledge, not virtue in the abstract, not the right lineage or the right wealth, but the right words spoken in the right order, the names of the guardians, the passwords and countersigns, the specific phrases that demonstrated to each doorkeeper that the one approaching knew where they were and what this place demanded. Anubis stood at such thresholds not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a condition to be satisfied, the way a lock is a condition and not an adversary. The jackal had been associated with burial and transition in the Egyptian tradition from very early periods. His form connected to the desert cemeteries at the edge of settlement, where jackals were known to move through the night, and which became, over time, the place the dead were given to the earth. What the tradition did later, what the theological refinements of many centuries accomplished, was to consolidate this association into a single precise divine function. Anubis, as guardian of thresholds, is a god whose role mirrors the structure of the text in which he appears. The Duat itself is a sequence of guarded gateways, each one a discrete region with its own inhabitants and requirements. Anubis, stationed at those gates, is in his correct place, a figure of careful passage in a text that is fundamentally about careful passage. The god whose nature the structure of the underworld was built to accommodate. The oldest sources credit him also with the preparation of the dead for burial, with the rites of embalming and the binding of the mummy, and in this the two aspects of his function are continuous with each other rather than separate. The body prepared with care was the body that could begin the journey. The journey was a sequence of guarded thresholds. At the thresholds, Anubis stood. The progression from the embalming table to the gates of the Duat moves through the same divine attention, the same jackal-headed figure who was present at the moment of preparation and present again at the moment of passage, his function complete only when the dead had moved through everything he guarded and arrived at what lay beyond it. There is a particular quality to the way the Duat depicts these gateways in its painted registers. The doorkeepers stand in attitudes of attention without urgency. They are not threatening. They are not welcoming. Exactly. They are present in the way that a condition is present, simply, completely, without ambiguity about what is required. The figures who approach them in the painted sequence carry their knowledge with them, and the knowledge is sufficient, and the threshold opens. What reads in the register as a procession of correct passage, figure after figure, moving through gate after gate, with the requisite words already known, is the tradition's image of the underworld as a place where order can be navigated by anyone who understands its structure. The Duat is not chaos, it is administered, and at each gate across the long interior of the night, the doorkeeper stands in the calm authority of a function that has never required anything other than what it has always required. In the fifth hour's deepest chamber, at the point in the night that the tradition understood to be furthest from both sunset and sunrise, something occurs that the Duat describes with unusual care. Ras and Osiris converge, the solar god traveling through the dark, and the god who presided over death and the dead and the earth itself. These two, the tradition holds, are briefly the same being. The solar and the chthonic touch at the midnight point of the journey, and what they exchange is essential. Re animates Osiris, brings to the god of the dead the radiance and force of the living sun, without which even death could not persist. Osiris provides Ra with the regenerative power of the earth and the dead, the deep, accumulated weight of everything that has passed and been transformed, without which the sun could not renew itself. Each one, the text says, is the soul of the other. The Egyptians did not describe this convergence as a collision or a struggle. There is nothing in the tradition's framing of this moment that suggests contradiction. What Ra carries and what Osiris holds are not in conflict. They are complementary to the point of identity. The soul of Ra is Osiris. The soul of Osiris is Ra. At the deepest point of the night, below the desert, and below the sky, and below the world of the living, these two aspects of the Egyptian cosmological order recognize themselves in each other, and for the duration of that recognition, were one. The Duat places this moment at the structural center of the journey, not accidentally. It is the axis around which the 12 hours turn. Everything that came before it was descent toward this point. Everything that follows it is return. What makes the image restful is its completeness. Nothing is left unresolved between Ra and Osiris. The god of the sun and the god of the dead have always needed what the other carries, and in the deepest chamber of the underworld, in the hour furthest from any light, they meet and acknowledge this in the specific way the tradition describes, not with ceremony or speech, but with the simplest possible convergence, the mutual recognition of two things that are the same thing seen from different sides of existence. The darkness of the fifth hour holds this moment as gently as anything in the duet holds anything. Thoth travels on the bark, the ibis-headed god of writing and of the measured reckoning of things, holds his reed pen and his palette, and in the Duat's painted registers, his posture is one of attention turned inward toward the surface he is writing on, toward the text he is producing as the bark moves through each successive hour. He serves the journey as its recorder and its adjudicator, the one who knows the identities of the gatekeepers, who carries within his knowledge the correct words for every threshold the bark must pass, who can adjudicate disputes about what is owed and what has been paid at each stage of the transit. Without Thoth, the journey would be a bark without a map. With him, it is a passage governed by knowledge of what the passage requires. The tradition credits Thoth in some of its versions as the divine author of the Duat itself, the god who composed the text that describes the journey he himself accompanies. There is something in this worth sitting with at length. The divine author of the book is traveling inside the book. He wrote the names of the gatekeepers, and now passes through the gates where those names are spoken. He composed the description of each hour's geography, and now moves through each hour in sequence. Whatever the tradition meant by crediting him with the text's authorship, what the image produces is a god who is simultaneously the map and the traveler, who holds in his knowledge the complete description of a country he is moving through for what is, by the logic of a journey repeated every night, always also the first time. His ibis head is tilted slightly in the tomb paintings toward whatever surface he is inscribing. The posture is one of concentration rather than effort, the concentration of a figure who has been doing this work for so long and with such precision that it requires no strain, only the steady precision, practiced attention of the divine scribe, who has been writing the night down since before the first night ended. Thoth is, among the gods of the Duat's night journey, the one who makes it legible. He holds the account of what happens in a language the living can read, the language of marks on a surface, the language of the tomb wall and the papyrus scroll. That he is present on the journey he records means that the record is not an approximation, but a witness account, the first and most complete version of a text that would later be inscribed by human hands on the walls of royal tombs and copied by human scribes onto papyrus, no larger than 2 cupped hands. Thoth was there. He wrote it down. The inscription on the wall is the copy, the night is the original. Sokar presides over the deepest and darkest region of the underworld's geography. In the 4th hour of the night, and across into the 5th, the Duat places the listener, or the dead, or the sun traveling in its diminished flesh body, in a terrain called Rosatau. The waterway ends here. There is no water in Rosatau. There is no light, except the fire breath of a serpent whose illumination is barely adequate to make the darkness visible rather than to relieve it. The bark cannot move under its own power without water, and so the tow rope crews lean into their work across sand, pulling the vessel across a surface that the painted registers render as level and without feature, a horizontal absence extending in all directions without boundary that the eye can find. In the center of this region, Sokar stands on his mound. He is hawk-headed and motionless. On either side of him, the sphinxes hold their position in the painted sequence with the same stillness, figures of complete arrest, unreachable by the ordinary movement of the journey, but existing in a register of the Duat that is beyond what the newly dead can fully comprehend, and beyond what even most of the underworld's inhabitants are shown to understand. Sokar is one of Egypt's oldest funerary deities. He predates the theological systems that would eventually absorb and incorporate him, the merger with Ptah and Osiris into the composite figure Ptah Sokar Osiris, which unified the creative force that made things, the funerary authority that presided over the dead, and the resurrection power that transformed both. But in Rossetto, in the dark of the fourth and fifth hours, Sokar exists in his ancient and undiluted form, the god of the deepest hour, of the deepest place, the one who has been standing in that cavern since a time older than the texts that describe him. The Amduat's depiction of Sokar's domain is characterized above all things by stillness. The sphinxes do not move. Sokar does not move. The mound on which he stands is sealed. The darkness around him is absolute in a way that the darkness of other regions of the Duat is not, because in other regions there is at least the traveling light of the solar bark, however diminished the sun's form has become for its night passage. In Rositau, even that light barely reaches. The text does not suggest that Sokar is waiting for anything. He is not a figure of anticipation. He is a figure of permanent governance, a god so deeply embedded in the structure of the underworld that his stillness is not the stillness of something paused, but of something that has always been exactly as it is, in the place it has always been, doing the one thing it has always been doing, which is keeping the deepest hour of the night, the way the deepest hour of the night has always needed to be kept. Within the cavern that the Amduat places inside Sokar's domain, there is something nested that is not visible to most of those who pass through the region. The scarab Khepri, the solar form associated with the coming dawn, with the sun's emergence and transformation, is present here, hidden at the lowest point of the journey, inside the sealed mound of Sokar himself. The tradition's logic is precise. The seed of the morning dawn is placed at the midnight point of the night. The form the sun will take at its emergence into the eastern sky is contained, invisibly within the body of the deepest underworld at the hour furthest from that emergence. Khepri is not visible to the ordinary dead. He is not accessible to the other inhabitants of Rossetto, but he is there. The fact of his presence, hidden and dormant at the center of the darkness, is the reason the darkness is not final. The dawn is already in the dark. It has been there since the last dawn ended. The gods who govern the Duat's hours are not, in the Egyptian account, interchangeable. Each has a specific nature, a specific position, and a specific function that only that particular configuration of divine power can serve. This specificity is part of what makes the tradition feel inhabitable at this hour, the sense of a cosmos that has been thought through to its particular details, that has assigned the right kind of attention to every part of itself, that has placed at each threshold the doorkeeper who is precisely suited to that threshold and no other. Hathor at the entrance with her sycamore tree, Anubis at the gates with his still and specific attention, Thoth on the bark with his reed pen recording what happens as it happens, Ravens and Osiris at the midnight convergence, briefly the same being, and Sakar in the cavern of Rosado, hawk-headed and motionless in the dark, the sphinxes beside him, the silence of the deepest hour of the night, absolutely complete around him. It is worth holding Anubis in attention for a moment longer, because the way the tradition positions him at the gates of the Duat reveals something about what the Duat was understood to be. He is not there to prevent passage. The dead will pass, the correctly equipped dead, the dead who carry the right knowledge, the right words, the demonstrated understanding of the underworld structure, will move through every gate in sequence without obstruction. What Anubis represents at each threshold is a standard, not a barrier. He embodies the requirement that passage through the underworld be made with knowledge rather than at random, that the structure of the Duat has an order, and that order exists not to exclude, but to distinguish between those who have prepared for the transit and those who have not. In a tradition where the preparation began before death and was encoded into the funerary texts placed inside the coffin, the threshold is the culminating test of a preparation that the living had made on behalf of the dead. There is something companionable in this. The Duat is a country where the right preparation makes passage possible. The tradition spent considerable effort across centuries of mortuary writing, priestly scholarship, and the labor of tomb construction, ensuring that the preparation was available and that the knowledge was transmitted. The Duat itself, in its earliest form inscribed exclusively on royal tomb walls, was part of that transmission. Later copies on papyrus, compressed into abbreviated registers no larger than the space between two hands, carried the same knowledge to the dead who owned them. The knowledge traveled with the dead into the dark. At each gate, the knowledge was sufficient. Anubis's presence at the threshold was not a threat to anyone who had been correctly prepared. It was a confirmation that the preparation had worked. Hathor stands beside her tree at the western entrance, and her tree offers its branches to everyone who arrives. The gesture is neither selective nor demanding. It is simply there, the extended reach of the sycamore over the arriving dead. The water offered in the last moment before the full interior of the Duat begins. What the tree represents in the tradition's understanding is a continuity between the world of the living and the world of the dead that is material rather than metaphorical. The tree grows in both places simultaneously, its roots in the earth and its canopy in the air, its fruit and water available to the living and the dead alike. Hathor at the sycamore is the tradition's way of saying that the passage from life into death does not move from care into indifference. Care persists. It is simply kept by different hands. The warmth of her welcome at the western entrance is deliberate and specific. The Egyptians knew what they were building when they placed a goddess with water and a fruit tree at the threshold of their underworld. They were building a world where the dead were received rather than abandoned, where the final journey began, not in isolation, but in the presence of a divine figure who had been waiting there since the first night of the world, and who would be waiting there at every subsequent nightfall for as long as the tradition continued to hold that this was true. Hathor's position at the entrance to the Duat is one of the most consistent images in Egyptian funerary art across a span of millennia. She is depicted on coffin walls and papyrus scrolls and tomb reliefs over periods of time that dwarf most other traditions' entire spans. She is still at the western horizon. The sycamore is still there. The branches still extend. The stars are reanimated in the dark before anyone above can see them. The Mduat's account of the night journey includes among its most specific images the description of the stars being woken within the underworld during the hours before dawn, figures of the constellations being returned to vitality inside the earth, their reanimation happening underground before any of the living world witnesses their emergence into the sky. The stars do not simply appear at the threshold of the eastern horizon. They are assembled below, restored from within, sent upward from the interior of the dark country before the eye of any living observer could catch them. The sky's population is prepared in the Duat before the sky receives it. The night's visible order is administered from the night's invisible interior. Thoth is connected to this as well, because Thoth in the Egyptian tradition was associated with the moon and with the measurement of time and the regulation of celestial movement. In the bark writing down the passage of each hour as the journey proceeds, Thoth is not only recording what happens in the Duat, but maintaining the precision of the account that governs what the sky above does in sequence. The stars that are readied below are readied in the order that his knowledge prescribes. The hours of the night that he records are the hours that correspond to the movements of the visible sky. The map below matches the sky above. The two are administered by the same knowledge, held in the same tilted head posture of steady, unhurried attention. This is what the tradition describes as the structure of the cosmos, not a world divided between the visible and the invisible, the upper and the lower, the living and the dead, as though these were separate countries with nothing between them, but a single continuous system in which everything that appears above has its governance below, and everything below is oriented toward what will appear above. The stars are readied in the Duat, the sun is regenerated in the Duat, the dead are adjudicated and positioned in the Duat, and then the horizon opens, and what has been prepared in the dark comes out into the light, and what is in the light goes down into the dark to be prepared again. Thoth writes it all down, Anubis stands at the gates, Hathor holds out water at the entrance, Sokar keeps the deepest chamber, with his sphinxes and his sealed mound, and the invisible seed of dawn in the dark inside it. The system requires each of them. Every hour of the night needs its keeper. The convergence of Ra and Osiris at the 5th hour is the system's hinge. Above ground, in the theology of the temples and the royal courts, Ra and Osiris represented two distinct and sovereign aspects of divine power, the solar force of the living world and the chthonic force of the dead world, the sky and the earth, the light and the dark. The Duat holds that in the underworld, at the deepest point of the night, these two do not simply coexist, they become mutually constitutive. Each one is what makes the other possible. Without Osiris, Ra cannot regenerate, cannot emerge from the 12th hour, changed and renewed and luminous, cannot become again the morning sun that rises at the eastern horizon and begins the visible world's day. Without Ra, Osiris cannot persist, cannot continue to hold his authority over the dead and the earth, and the deep interior of the night, cannot maintain the vitality of the underworld on which the living world depends for its own continuation. This mutual dependence is not a tension the tradition found uncomfortable. It is the tradition's most fundamental cosmological claim. The living world and the dead world are not in competition. They are each other's condition. What sustains the sun also sustains the kingdom of the dead, and what sustains the kingdom of the dead also sustains the sun. The meeting of Ra and Osiris at midnight is the moment this is made most explicit, the moment the tradition carved onto tomb walls and inscribed on papyrus scrolls and maintained through 3,000 years of religious practice as the central, irreducible fact of what the night means. Sokar stands in the cavern of Rosatawa. The darkness around him is complete. The sphinxes on either side of him have been standing there for as long as any source remembers, and they will be standing there after the last source has been read. The silence of the deepest hour of the underworld is a silence that predates the Duat's composition and will outlast its last inscription, because it is not a created silence, it is the condition of the place, the natural stillness of the interior of the earth at the point in the night furthest from any horizon, the quiet that does not require anything to produce it and does not diminish when nothing is there to notice it. What the tradition did in composing the Duat and inscribing it on tomb walls and training priests in its content and later copying it onto papyrus for the wealthy dead was to describe this silence with precision. It sent language into the cavern of Rosadio. It sent the names of the sphinxes and the measurements of the serpent and the geometry of the mound. It sent the words spoken at every gate and the count of the welcoming figures in the first corridor and the description of the tow rope crews leaning into the sand and the image of Thoth's tilted ibis head above his reed pen. It sent all of this into the dark, and the silence absorbed it without displacing it, and the gods kept their hours the same way they had always kept them, and the record remained. Hathor is still at the western horizon beside the sycamore tree. The branches of the tree extend over whatever arrives. The water she offers is as full as it has ever been, held out in the gesture that has been held out since the first night of the world, in the warmth of the threshold that the tradition designed to be warm, a welcome at the entrance to something very large and very dark, extended to the arriving dead, without condition, without reservation, simply present in the way that care is present when it has been built into the structure of the world itself. Anubis stands at the first gate. He has been standing there since before the Duat was written. The gate behind him and the gates ahead of him run in sequence through the interior of the Duat, each one guarded, each one navigable by the dead who carry the right knowledge. His attention is neither warm nor cold, it is precise. It is the precise attention of a figure whose function is exactly proportioned to the structure it inhabits, who has never been asked to do anything other than what he was made to do, who will still be doing it when the last visitor passes through. Thoth writes in the dark of the bark, traveling through the hours of the text he composed, his reed pen steady, his palette open, the record accumulating with each mile of underworld that passes. The stars are being assembled below the sky, readied for the emergence that will happen before any living eye is open. The convergence at the midnight chamber has already occurred, and what Ra carries out of it, the accumulated depth of what Osiris holds, the regenerative weight of the earth and the dead, is already changing the quality of his transit, already beginning the long preparation for the 12th hour and the serpent's mouth and the eastern horizon. And in the cavern of Rossetto, in the deepest silence of the deepest hour, Sokar stands on his mound with the sphinxes beside him and the invisible seed of the morning dawn inside the sealed earth beneath him. He does not move. He does not wait. He simply keeps the hour that has always been his to keep, in the place that has always been his to keep it. The darkness around him, absolute, and the silence around him, complete, and the invisible Khepri in the dark below him, already carrying the light of a morning that is not yet anywhere in the world. The gods of the Duat's 12 hours are not diminished by the length of their watch. They are not tired. The tradition does not describe Anubis growing weary of the gates, or Hathor withdrawing from the western threshold, or Thoth setting down his pen because the account has grown too long. These are not figures subject to the fatigue that the living world produces in everything it touches. They are the administration of a cosmos that runs because they are running it, every night and in the same order, and with the same specific functions they have always performed. the hours turning in sequence around the central convergence of the solar and the chthonic, the bark moving through each successive region, the tow rope taut in the sand, the water returning in the later hours, the bark lifting on it again and moving forward under its own power as the darkness begins its very gradual concession to the approach of what has been coming since the moment of sunset. The tradition is still in the earth. The tomb walls of the Valley of the Kings still carry the painted registers of the Duat's 12 hours, the stick figures arranged in their horizontal lines across the cream-colored stone, the bark at the center of each hour's frame, the tow rope crews angled forward, the gatekeepers standing in their positions. The text is still legible. The figures are still present in the specific, spare, unhurried way they were painted, more like a diagram of a country than a decoration of a room, a map of the interior of the night, made by human hands, in a chamber cut from limestone, at a time so far back in the record that it belongs to a world that has not existed for 30 centuries, and yet the walls are still there. The figures are still in their positions.